she describes herself as a transition woman. Blue Greenberg is a Gloria Steinem of the Orthodox community, and I kind of feel she's an Emma Goldman of the 1980s. Blue has written How to Run a Jewish Household and also on Women in Judaism, A View from Tradition. Blue strives to liberate orthodoxy by attempting to redefine the theology of woman as Jew, and it gives me great pleasure in introducing her to you today and to me. This is my first time meeting you. Welcome to the show, Blue.
Thanks.
First, I think what a lot of people want to know is how can you claim to be a Jewish feminist and an Orthodox Jew at the same time? I'm sure you get that a lot, but isn't this a contradiction of terms?
Well, actually, I started out, I've been an Orthodox Jew all my life, and I started out being, I guess, what I would call a secular feminist. And I think I was a secular feminist probably for 10 years before I ever began to relate some of the issues of feminism to traditional Judaism, because I felt I was very comfortable with my Judaism and comfortable with my role definitions and my obligations and my release from certain obligations. And then in 1973, I was invited to participate in the First National Women's Conference and to give a paper on the subject of feminism in Judaism. And I began to think through the issues. I guess they'd been building up over the course of the previous few years. But I came to realize that, yes, many of the messages of the women's movement are translatable into Jewish theology and the Jewish value system. And I think there's a certain tension between the two, but it's not, it's negotiable. The impasse is negotiable.
Well, are women equal to men according to halakha, not according to Blue Greenberg?
According to halakha, in most areas they are equal. Most areas of, for example, damages, certainly all of the thou shalt not restrictions and performances are equally binding upon men and women, and certainly all of the ethical laws are equally binding upon men and women. But in some of the ritual areas, women are not equal. I would say they are in hierarchical relationship to men, partly they are released from certain obligations, and in consequence they don't have certain rights that flow from certain of the obligations. And then in the area of the one area in which there is inequity is in family law, in Jewish divorce law. I think women, there's a potential for abuse, and sometimes women suffer that because men have rights in terms of Jewish divorce, the laws of get, that women don't have.
I'm glad you brought that up. Later in the show we'll get into specific areas where you think there's a need for reform. But before we get into that, do men consider women equal in the Orthodox movement? And more importantly, do women consider themselves equal?
Quite a good question. Actually, it's in flux, and of course you can't generalize about the whole class of men and the whole class of women, but I would say to a great extent tradition did generate a different view of men and women, that men were up to certain religious tasks and women simply weren't. Men, for example, had the whole area of this very large and significant enterprise and responsibility for study of Torah, Talmud Torah. Women didn't have that mitzvah upon them, even though they were learned and well-versed in the laws. They weren't involved in the process of study. And I think those things do affect one's perception of the opposite sex. So the interesting question, the second part of your question, is really fascinating, because part of the struggle now is for women to begin to perceive themselves in a different light, as capable and fully having full potential, full and equal potential.
What I'm curious about, I've read what other people have also, how they've reacted to your writings and what you advocate. How do you reconcile, or how do you resist the ridicule of the Orthodox Jewish community that is really set in its ways without jeopardizing your standing in the Orthodox community?
Well, I have to say that I think there are several factors. One is that I'm in a very fortunate position, because I'm part of the Orthodox community, and I'm not a stranger, and I have many friends, and I had a whole network of friends and a support network before I took on these crazy newfangled ideas of mine. And I didn't, my friends perhaps argued with me, but I didn't lose that support, that friendship group, and my family as well. And my husband, I would say, is a very key factor. He's been very supportive of all of these, and he's taught me probably most of what I know over the course of the last 27 years of marriage. And I think he feels much in sympathy and on many of these women's issues. In fact, I think he was probably a feminist before I was.
But isn't he alone among men?
Well, he's not totally alone. That was the second thing I wanted to say, was that while I find that I'm less and less the target of the butt of jokes, which is to me a sign that there is some real grappling with the issues. It's not just something you can wave away or laugh away. So I'm happy for that. And then I sort of learned certain techniques, even though I didn't articulate them to myself, but over the course of the years, I learned certain protective techniques, because I don't want to be distant. I want to be part of this community, and this is the community that has nurtured me and that has taught me. So I've learned certain, like I don't enter into every argument. I know it's not going to lead me down any constructive path, and I have a finite amount of energy, and I don't want to burn myself up, so I don't enter into every fray. And writing has been a wonderful avenue of expression for me.
You're not as close to the punch either.
That's right.
There's some who say, radical, you're a heretic, that the entire structure of Orthodox Judaism would crumble if the sexual hierarchy were altered at all. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't, although I find it that's a threatening and painful accusation, because I don't want to be associated or accused of destroying Judaism or Jewish values. But I don't believe that it'll crumble and fall apart. And so I put on what I call my special pair of blinders, which is to say that really what the agenda is greater entry and greater access for women, rather than, and somebody else will interpret it as a watering down of Judaism, but I have to say that increase women's learning, increase of women's tefillah, prayer, women's equal rights in terms of Jewish divorce law. This is a building up of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit, and not a diminution of it.
I had read a description of you, of someone who said you're a pioneer who has made it possible for women to say ouch. I'm just wondering, how do husbands of these reformed women respond to you, and how do they respond to their newly reformed wives? And I envision these women stealing away in the night, kind of like the women suffragettes, hearing the word of Blue Greenberg.
Well, I think there's a lot of ferment in the Orthodox community, and I have to say I think there's a lot of goodwill, which is a very heartening sign. You can look at some of the resistance and say, this is a response to some uppity women, but I don't really think that that's what is there. I think what is there is there are people who are who love the tradition, who want to be faithful to it, and who are genuinely threatened with because halakha, Jewish law, is resistant to change, and anytime you tamper with what is sacred and divine, you run that risk of diminishing the sacredness of it. So I think that the people who are defensive and fearful are that way out of a love of the tradition, and I have to listen to that. That says something to me. But I think there have been enough experiments, both in the liberal Jewish communities and also even within Orthodoxy. There's enough going on there that people are beginning to get the idea that it doesn't have to destroy. If a girl is bat mitzvah, it's not going to destroy Yiddishkeit. If a woman studies Talmud, it's not going to destroy Yiddishkeit. If they restructure or reinterpret Jewish divorce law so that there's no abuse or no blackmail, it's going to build up. It's moving Judaism to its own best level.
So you're sensing a greater acceptance within the community,
or
just more willingness to hear you. Okay, let's get into the specifics. How would you change the liturgy?
I'm really not sure. The problem lies in that, well, there are several problems. One is that women don't have the same force of obligation, and they don't have the same fullness of obligation in terms of liturgical responsibilities, and therefore, in consequence, there's sort of in this domino effect. They were released from, there's a category of release of women from time-bound positive commandments, and prayer falls into that category, and yet women are not exempt from prayer, but they've tended over the years to exempt themselves, and as a result of the loss of rights that go with public prayer, they've tended to exempt themselves. And moreover, there are certain areas in which they're simply not obligated. Now, for example, a woman doesn't have an obligation to say Kaddish. A woman doesn't have an obligation for certain of the tefillot. And some of the language of the prayer also speaks only to men. Some of the morning prayers and some of the morning blessings, or a tefillin and talit, tzitzit, these are things that apply only to men. So there's a whole number of things that are working here against women's inclusion.
In fact, isn't the morning prayer, isn't there a prayer that says, "Thank you for not making me a woman"?
Right, that's the sexual preference prayer,
Yeah.
right. And in approximately the 14th century, some rabbi felt sufficiently uncomfortable about that to include a prayer, a sexual preference prayer for women, which women recite. It's we say, now I happen to think that a sexual preference prayer is a wonderful prayer. It's really, thank God we are men and women. It's just unfortunate that it has to be stated in the negative, where truly a man should say, "Thank God for creating me a man," and a woman should say, "Thank God for creating me a woman," because we do feel that gratitude. So one way to go in terms of the liturgy is that women be incorporated in the obligation, and in consequence in the rites as well, part of the spiritual congregation. And I think it's not going to, if women are included in the quorum, I don't think it's going to be destructive of Judaism.
Now, on the same token, you do believe in the mechitza, the separation of men and women, but there again you see there should be some reform too, allowing more observation.
Right. Yeah, I don't think, partly because I'm used to it, I'm conditioned to it, partly because I'm comfortable with it, and although it's not, I don't think it's the only way for Jews to pray, it's certainly a valid way, and I can see, I often think that in a way there's a much greater sense of human sexuality in a synagogue where there is a separate seating, and it's so, so thick you can almost.
But couldn't that be distracting?
I think it's very healthy, and maybe even more so in these times when we have a lot of confusion about human sexuality. I think it's very healthy. And the other thing about separate seating, which is maybe it wasn't the original intention, I'm sure, but there's a much greater social bonding in those that setup, male bonding and female bonding, and that's also, community is really bonding of individuals, and it's a very strong sense of community. And sociability, which is fine for a synagogue.
Opposite of that kind of binding and that feeling of togetherness, even though you're separated, is divorce, where you feel there really are some inequities in that area. Can a woman be a witness to a get?
No, technically a woman cannot be a witness in a religious court. Although there are certain exceptions, which I think which offer us sufficient precedent for reinterpreting that limitation upon women. But the Torah says on the basis of two witnesses, and the word anashim is used, and so therefore, rather the two witnesses, and it's in the masculine tense, as most words are, and the Talmud says men and not women, and consequently women never functioned as witnesses. And that's one of the arguments, in fact, in conservative movement as to why women should not be permitted to become rabbis. You know, there's again that domino effect. But interestingly, a woman's testimony is, firstly, the law, there is a precedent, in fact, permitting a woman's testimony in a case of an aguna, a woman whose husband has disappeared and he's not been verified as dead, and so she doesn't have the writ of divorce, and unless someone attests to the fact that he was seen no longer in this life, her life, she cannot establish any new social relationships, or she cannot remarry. So they permit a woman's testimony in that case, in fact, the wife herself. And then there are other instances where women's testimony has
Can she initiate a divorce?
In Talmudic times, she could initiate a divorce by going to the Bet Din, the court of law, and if her husband had not lived up to the obligations that were binding upon him to perform in the marriage, then she could go to the Bet Din and say, look, he's not giving me sufficient sexual satisfaction. That was one good important reason for divorce. You know, he's impotent, or he has these and these unlikable qualities, or he won't move to Palestine with me, for various other reasons. She could sue for a divorce, and then the Bet Din, the court of law, the rabbis would summon the man and require him to give a divorce. Now, the principle still was that he had to give it of his own free will. But there was a Talmudic principle which said, we force him until he says, I want to.
Blue, you've mentioned this area before. That's education. In order for a woman to know the liturgy, in order for her to become a witness to a get, she really has to be educated. You have said that parents really have to encourage their daughters as well as their sons to attend the yeshivas, to pursue a Jewish education. You yourself have a daughter, Deborah, who still attends the yeshiva in Israel. Are parents following that rule today?
Yeah, I think that's one of the wonderful things about the impact of feminism on Orthodox Judaism. And that's where the real revolution is, in general, in Judaism, is in this area of education. And the truth is, you know, in my mother's generation, my mother had five sisters and two brothers, and the two brothers had a Jewish education, and the five sisters did not have much of a Jewish education at all, and which was very unfortunate. My mother really would have made a wonderful scholar, but it just simply wasn't the thing to do. In my generation already, it was different. Most Orthodox families did educate their children, but not to the same extent that they educated their sons. In my own family, I have two sisters. We were three girls, and so my parents gave us the best Jewish education that they could find. In fact, moved from Seattle, Washington to New York in search of a better education. Now, in the community today, no self-respecting Orthodox Jewish parent would not give their daughter as fine a Jewish education as they could possibly get, and that's quite incredible. Lots of young women going on to higher learning.
We've just moved from developing a yentl of the daughters, maybe that's a little bit too extreme, but someone who can really be well versed in Jewish law and Talmud. What about business? Something I was thinking about. Let's say a man has a prosperous business. He dies, unfortunately, and his wife takes over. Are the merchants going to respect her the same way? Are they going to do business with her?
Yes, I think so. Firstly, we do have some of those instances. Women did run some certain businesses in Europe in the medieval period and the early modern period. It was probably the exception to have a woman as a head of a business, but there were instances. And increasingly women are in business these days. And I think Jews are no more immune to the impact of the broader culture than any other group. And perhaps even, you know, they say Jews are like everyone else, only more so. And so Jewish women are involved in business. In fact, last June, we were sitting around the Shabbos table, and 4 of our kids were in college at that time. And they have a lot of Orthodox friends, and they were talking about what we were taking sort of an informal tally of what the female graduates were doing. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, we discovered that I would say something like 80% of them were making choices in one of 3 professions: a master's, an MBA, they were going on to graduate school, the majority, an MBA, a law degree, or medicine. It's really quite interesting. But lots of Jewish women are going into business.
Ambitious. It seems all the areas we've discussed today, the divorce, liturgy, business, all affects the main family unit. How will these reforms that you've suggested affect the family structure in the Orthodox Jewish community?
It's a very serious question, and something that has to be asked continually, because we can't lose sight of that. And the family is the most significant unit, and in terms of transmitting religious values and in terms of affiliation with community, it's really primarily through the strength of the family that so many of the institutions have been maintained. And it goes without saying that the emphasis on careerism and self-actualization and independence really pulls away, in a sense, from certain family values. To construct a family, you have to sometimes be self-sacrificing and give of yourself and have a certain generosity of spirit. And so it's a balance, it's a balancing act. And I think people who come out of a traditional community and who stay rooted in tradition have the great benefit there of not losing sight of those eternal family values. We're seeing a sharp rate of decline, a sharp birth rate decline. And
you just mentioned Jewish survival, which is of great concern to the Jewish community. The things which you have suggested today, won't that really lead to more divisiveness within the community, and won't that become a threat to Jewish survival?
Well, it's going to lead, the way I see it, if I see modern Orthodoxy moving in the direction of incorporating some of these new values for women and some other aspects, certain additional aspects of equality for women, it will lead to a greater rift between the modern Orthodox and the more right-wing or more fundamentalist Orthodox. And that makes me feel quite sad, because one of the things we cannot afford these days is disunity, and we unfortunately have quite a bit of it. But then I have to say, what's the other option? The other option is to simply say, well, we'll maintain the status quo, and we're locked into the status quo, and I think that's a position of less integrity, and everything in life is a trade-off, including Jewish communal life.
You mentioned the Jewish community, and the fulcrum of the Jewish community is the rabbi. I tried in vain to envision Rabbi Ruth Janowitz, dancing with the men at Simchat Torah, and all I could conjure up was a parody by Woody Allen. Now, you feel that having a female rabbi in the Orthodox community makes sense. If it is so right to you, what is wrong with it?
Well, for one, it's wrong according to the community because it's so strange and it's so remote from anybody's consciousness. In fact, there's so little literature and debate and discussion in the traditional sources because nobody ever entertained that thought. It was so remote from anyone's consciousness. And I can understand the feelings in community because I felt very much that way myself. 11 years ago, when I first read about a Reform rabbi, it was terribly upsetting and a great affront, and I thought it was, and I defined it as against halakha. But gradually I came to reflect over the years and to ask different questions and to see that through learning, a woman has at the very least, can meet the qualifications for ordination, for smicha, and then we'll take it from there.
Blue, you have said the real agenda for the Orthodox Jewish community is not the feminization of Judaism, but rather the heightened Jewishness of females. Are we going to see a quantum leap into this realization, or will we see this happen gradually?
I think it'll be incremental. I think it has to be I think it has to develop organically. In other words, internally consistent, internally comfortable, and I think and with some fidelity to the past and a sense of continuity with the past. And I think that requires incremental stages and a certain amount of patience. But that's okay. I think we're pointed in the right direction, and it's irreversible. And so, if one generation, the next generation, I think we'll get there.
Right. For your sake, for our sake, I hope it does happen in our generation. Blue Greenberg, thank you so much for being with us and clarifying and redefining the role of the woman in the Jewish community. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And for Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.